The conference room of Aegis Capital Group went completely silent. On the wall, the massive projector screen was filled with cascading rows of crimson error messages, bathing the room in a grim red glow. $120 million of financial infrastructure had gone completely dark in a matter of minutes. Our chief executive officer, Maxwell Holden, stood at the head of the long mahogany table, his knuckles white as he gripped his phone. He had just spent 20 minutes on a call with our most important client, Ridgeline Investment Group, attempting to explain why $47 million in pending trades had suddenly vanished into the digital void. Maxwell closed his eyes, his jaw clenched, and demanded answers in a dangerously low voice that made everyone in the room shrink back. Oliver Croft, our newly appointed vice president of operations, fumbled with his laptop, sweat beading on his forehead as he mumbled that all three redundancy systems had crashed simultaneously. He insisted that such an occurrence was mathematically impossible. Yet, there we were, staring at the evidence of that failure. Maxwell turned his cold gaze toward the young, expensive consultant sitting across the table. Spencer Finch, the lead architect from Vertex Solutions, who had spent weeks boasting about his optimization project, stood pale and silent. His promised 40% efficiency boost had resulted in total collapse. Maxwell slammed his palm on the table, reading the incident log. The cascade began at 9:58 in the evening, with warnings starting at 8:47. He demanded to know who was monitoring the systems, but silence met his question. Finally, Oliver Croft cleared his throat, explaining that the new automated monitoring system installed by Spencer's team was supposed to catch and resolve these issues before they escalated. Maxwell asked where that automated system was now. Oliver whispered that the monitoring cluster was part of the network that had crashed. Maxwell ordered Oliver to pull up the project authorization form immediately. Oliver's fingers shook as he clicked through his files. The screen shifted to a memo dated 3 weeks prior. Maxwell demanded that Oliver read the section regarding staff oversight. Oliver's voice was barely a whisper as he read. The text stated that due to budget optimization initiatives, overtime authorization for legacy systems staff would be restricted, as modern automated systems would provide adequate coverage. Maxwell asked who wrote that memo, and Oliver admitted he did. The chief executive officer then asked who had approved cutting the overtime for our senior systems administrator, the one who had spent 18 years building and maintaining these exact servers. Everyone in the room knew the answer, and the color drained completely from Oliver's face as he tried to justify it as a budget decision. Maxwell ignored the excuse and demanded my phone number. Gavin Ward, one of our network engineers sitting in the corner, spoke up. He explained that they had been trying to call me for over an hour, but I was not answering. Maxwell asked why I was ignoring the calls. Gavin replied that it was 10:47 in the evening, my overtime had been cut, and I was simply following the company policy. That was the moment the reality of the situation finally hit the room. It was the silence of consequences arriving exactly on schedule. Maxwell looked at Oliver Croft, his eyes like blocks of ice, and told him that he had better pray, I answered. Because if the systems were not back online by morning, he would be explaining to the board why a $120 million network was dead. That was when Gavin received a text from me. I had replied that I would need written overtime approval before I could log in. Maxwell ordered Gavin to send it immediately. Gavin explained that the protocol required human resources to process the emergency request for final approval. The chief executive officer laughed bitterly, noting that it was the same protocol Oliver had used to cut my compensation. We all watched as the startup confidence completely drained from Oliver Croft. Maxwell ordered him to pull up the digital signature on the memo. The screen displayed the approval. It was signed by Oliver Croft, vice president of operations, with the justification that legacy staff were no longer necessary for after-hours manual intervention. Maxwell stared at the signature, his voice dropping to a freezing whisper as he told Oliver that we would have a very long conversation about innovation versus incompetence once the system was restored. Spencer Finch tried to slip out the door, but Maxwell ordered him to sit down. At 10:52 in the evening, the system confirmed my emergency overtime had been officially approved. The room waited, barely breathing, for me to log in and save them from the disaster Oliver Croft had created. To explain how we arrived at this crisis, I need to back up 12 hours. My name is Donald Vance, a 54-year-old senior systems administrator. For 18 years, I have kept these databases running 24 hours a day. I live with my wife Clara and our children, Julian, who is 12, and Hazel, who is 9. My job is not glamorous, but it is essential. The email that started this mess arrived on a Tuesday morning. The email was written in the standard corporate dialect, a language specifically designed to wrap bad news in layers of polite, meaningless business jargon. The subject line read, "Operational Efficiency and Resource Realignment." I knew what it meant the moment I opened it. When a company uses 5 words when one would do, they are preparing to take something away from you. The message stated that effective immediately, all after-hours technical operations would require prior written authorization from executive leadership. It went on to explain that as part of our commitment to financial efficiency, legacy compensation structures were being reviewed to ensure proper alignment with the current market standards. Legacy staff. That was the term they used to describe me. 18 years of 60-hour work weeks, of answering emergency calls at 3 in the morning, and of canceling family dinners because a server went offline. All of that was reduced to a label meant to suggest I was an expensive relic of the past. I stood up and walked down the hall to the office of Oliver Croft. Oliver had been with the company for only 14 months, having arrived from a failed tech startup that had burned through $40 million in venture capital. Somehow, that failure qualified him to manage operations at our financial firm. Oliver was in his office, performing curls with dumbbells, looking like a caricature of a young executive trying to appear productive. He looked up, saying he had a minute. I walked in and asked him about the sudden change to the overtime policy. Oliver set the weights down, smiling a superficial smile that did not reach his eyes. He said that they were simply trimming the fat and getting lean, claiming it was just business. I pointed out that our databases ran 24 hours a day. If a critical process failed at 8 in the evening, I could not wait until morning. Oliver shrugged, suggesting that we could hire a night contractor for a fraction of the cost. He leaned back in his leather chair and told me that the world had moved on to cloud infrastructure and automated monitoring. He asserted that they did not need people babysitting servers anymore, suggesting that some of our legacy staff were becoming somewhat outdated. Outdated. The word hung in the air like a physical insult. I had designed the failover protocols that kept our entire network alive during 3 major regional power grids collapses. I had migrated our entire legacy database to a modern secure cluster just 2 years ago. I kept my voice perfectly calm as I asked if the overtime restriction was absolute. Oliver nodded, warning me that if we had that many emergencies, they would have to examine the competence of the people managing the systems. It was a threat, thin and obvious. I nodded, said thank you, and walked back to my desk. My hands were steady, but I felt a cold anger settling in my chest. I had sacrificed 18 years for this firm. I had missed my son Julian's first steps because I was stuck in a server room fixing a storage array. I had spent my daughter Hazel's 9th birthday sitting in the corner of a bowling alley with a laptop on my knees, typing commands while she blew out her candles. Clara and I had delayed vacations and missed anniversaries, all to ensure Aegis Capital Group never experienced downtime. Now I was outdated. I sat at my desk and looked at the clock. It was 9:47 in the morning. I opened my administration panel and began disabling my custom automated checking scripts. Every script I had written over 18 years to run outside of business hours was disabled. Every alert that pinged my personal phone after 5 in the evening was turned off. The detectors I had built to catch database anomalies were shut down. If they wanted me to work strictly from 9 to 5, I would follow their directive to the letter. Not a single second more. Gavin Ward rolled his chair over to my desk, looking at me with concern. He asked if I was all right. I told him they had cut the overtime and called us outdated. Gavin shook his head in frustration, muttering that Oliver Croft was going to run the firm into the ground. Gavin mentioned that Oliver had recently suggested moving our core transaction databases to a public cloud network, a suggestion so dangerously insecure it had shocked the entire engineering team. Welcome to the payback, I thought. I spent the remainder of that Tuesday documenting my daily tasks, organizing every database key, and updating the system files. I did it because I was a professional, not out of malice. If something failed, the next person would need to know how to repair it. But I also added a clear note to the operational log, stating that all after-hours monitoring had been terminated in accordance with the new executive overtime policy. Clara noticed the difference when I walked through the door at 5:30 in the evening. I was never home before 7. She asked if I had been laid off. I told her it was worse. They had told me I was no longer worth my compensation. Clara pulled me into a quiet hug. She understood the value of my experience, and she knew how much I had given to that office. She asked what I was going to do. I told her I was going to follow their policy exactly, working my hours and nothing more. Clara looked at me and asked if I was sure it was wise. I told her they wanted to see what an outdated administrator looked like, and they were about to find out. The rest of the week passed with a strange, quiet regularity. I arrived at 9 in the morning and left at precisely 5 in the evening. On Wednesday afternoon, I packed my bag and walked out of the building at exactly 5:02 in the evening. It felt like an act of quiet rebellion. I had spent 18 years being available 24 hours a day, and now I was simply turning my back and going home to my family. The systems I had built were stable, so nothing broke immediately. They did not need constant maintenance, but they did require someone who understood their quirks when the unexpected occurred. On Friday afternoon, Oliver Croft called a department meeting. He stood in front of a digital slide deck titled Operational Modernization and Future Verification. He spoke at length about synergistic cloud integration, automated maintenance protocols, and advanced compliance monitors, using every modern corporate buzzword he could find. Gavin leaned over and whispered to me, asking if Oliver actually understood what any of those terms meant. I whispered back that he probably did not. Oliver announced that they were bringing in a team of consultants from Vertex Solutions to audit our infrastructure and implement optimizations. He explained that this was about future-proofing our business. I raised my hand and asked if these consultants would have access to the production databases during the migration. Oliver answered that they would, claiming it was necessary for a complete assessment. I then asked if the consultants would be supervised by internal staff during their after-hours work, noting that since overtime was no longer authorized, no senior administrators would be available after 5 in the evening. Oliver's jaw tightened, and he brushed the question aside, saying we would address that issue when the time came. That time arrived much faster than anyone anticipated. On the following Tuesday, 3 consultants from Vertex Solutions arrived at our office. They were young, carried laptops decorated with tech stickers, and had the same superficial confidence as Oliver. The lead consultant, Spencer Finch, spent an hour looking at our server racks before declaring that our architecture was seriously out of date. He argued that we were wasting resources on redundant verification pipelines, claiming that their automated systems could handle everything with a single verification check. I warned Spencer that our triple verification pipeline was designed to comply with federal financial regulations and that bypassing it could trigger a system lock. Spencer smiled condescendingly, telling me that their software was advanced enough to handle compliance automatically. Oliver agreed with the consultant, announcing that the optimization project would begin the following week and would take only 14 days. Gavin looked horrified, whispering that overhauling our transaction pipeline in 2 weeks was madness. But Oliver had made his decision, and at Aegis Capital Group, the vice president of operations always got what he wanted. I went home that evening and told Clara about the meeting. She asked if they were replacing me, and I explained that they were replacing my systems with cheaper, less secure versions that would likely fail. I told her that when it broke, it would no longer be my concern, as they had made it clear they did not value my knowledge. The next week, Spencer's team began their changes. They moved quickly, virtualizing servers and altering database structures that had been tuned over years of operations. I watched from the sidelines, offering no advice since they did not ask for it. On Wednesday, Gavin stopped me in the break room, looking stressed. He told me they were modifying the transaction processing database and that Spencer had ignored his warnings about the complex dependencies between our domestic and international validation scripts. Gavin said the consultants claimed their automation would handle the dependencies. I simply took a sip of my coffee and said nothing. There was nothing left to say. On Thursday afternoon, one of the primary database clusters began generating warnings. It was a minor error, the kind of issue my old automated scripts would have caught and resolved in minutes. But those scripts were gone, and Spencer's automated system ignored the alert. I noticed the warning in the log at 4:30 in the evening. I wrote a brief note, placed the issue in the general support queue, and at 5 in the evening I closed my laptop and left the building. That night, I helped Clara make dinner and played board games with Julian and Hazel. We laughed, and for the first time in years, I felt completely disconnected from the stress of the office. At 8:47 in the evening, my personal phone buzzed with an automated email warning. I glanced at it, saw it was a critical error on the database, and set the phone face down on the table. At 9:15, another alert arrived. At 9:58, my phone began ringing. It was Gavin. I let it ring. At 10 o'clock, the phone rang again, this time showing Oliver Croft's name. I declined the call. At 10:17, Gavin sent a text message. He wrote that the transaction system was completely offline, that Spencer's automation could not resolve the crash, and that the CEO had arrived at the office. Gavin begged me to log in. I waited, letting the panic build in the office. Then I texted Gavin back, stating that company policy required written overtime approval from executive leadership before I could perform any work. I sat back and waited for the system to process their desperation. The hastily completed overtime authorization form arrived in my email inbox at 10:31 in the evening, carrying Oliver Croft's digital signature. In the justification field, he had written, "Critical database failure, immediate support required." I could have logged in immediately, but I decided to follow the corporate handbook to the letter. I approved the form and routed it back to Human Resources for the mandatory emergency processing confirmation. Our corporate policy stated that no after-hours work could begin without this final Human Resources validation. At 10:44, the confirmation arrived. Everything was official, and my rate was locked in. I opened my laptop and connected to the Aegis Capital Group network. The main administration dashboard was covered in red warning banners. The primary transaction processing database was completely down, the backup database was offline, and the emergency failover system was frozen. The entire financial pipeline was blocked, leaving $50 million in pending transactions stuck in limbo. The moment I logged in, Oliver Croft called my phone. His voice was trembling with panic as he pleaded with me to tell him what was happening. He explained that Spencer Finch had run his optimization script, and then everything had frozen. Oliver warned that the trading desk was in chaos, and that if we did not resolve the crash immediately, the firm would face massive regulatory fines and lawsuits from our clients. I told him to put Spencer Finch on the line. Spencer's voice was stripped of all its former confidence as he stammered that they had streamlined the verification database by removing the redundant checks. I closed my eyes and shook my head. I explained to the young consultant that the triple verification system was not redundant, but was a specific requirement mandated by federal financial regulations for any transaction exceeding $10,000. By reducing the pipeline to a single check, Spencer's software had flagged every pending transaction as a compliance violation, causing the automated security protocols to lock down the entire network to prevent illegal activity. Spencer suggested rolling back the changes, but I warned him that a rollback would wipe out the $50 million in the queue, forcing us to manually recreate every trade, which would violate reporting timelines. Oliver gasped, asking what we could do. I told him I would have to rebuild the verification pipeline manually in the live database, restoring the triple check protocol without losing the pending queue. I warned them that it was highly delicate work that would take at least 3 to 4 hours. Oliver cried that we did not have that much time, as the international markets would open in 2 hours. I told him he should have considered that before authorizing changes to a network he did not understand. I hung up the phone and got to work. Rebuilding a complex verification pipeline on a live, frozen database is like performing delicate surgery on a moving train. Every script is connected to dozens of tables, and a single syntax error can cause permanent data corruption. I started with the failover cluster, carefully separating the compliance logs and rebuilding the verification blocks. By 11:30, Clara brought me a cup of hot coffee, telling me to take my time. I smiled, took a sip, and focused on the code. At 12:47 in the morning, my phone buzzed with a text from a number I did not recognize. It was Maxwell Holden, the chief executive officer. He wrote that Oliver had explained the situation and that I had his full authority to take whatever steps were necessary. I did not reply as I was too busy working. By 1:38 in the morning, I had successfully restored the backup database, confirming that the transactions in that queue were secure. The primary database was more difficult. Spencer's scripts had modified the security tables, creating a tangled mess of permissions. I spent an hour unwinding the automated changes, restoring the original system settings from the physical archives I had saved. At 2:43 in the morning, I hit a major obstacle. Spencer's code had overwritten a unique custom script I had written 5 years ago to handle currency conversions for international accounts. The script was not documented in the standard registry, and I did not have a backup file. I would have to rewrite all 300 lines of code from memory. My eyes were burning and my muscles were stiff, but I forced myself to focus, typing the commands line by line. By 3:47 in the morning, the script was finished. I uploaded the code, initiated the validation sequence, and held my breath. The screen began to update. The red warning banners turned to yellow and then to green. The $50 million in pending transactions began processing, each trade registering with the correct timestamp. At 3:52, the primary database synchronized with the backup systems. I sent a simple text to Maxwell Holden, stating that the systems were fully operational and no data had been lost. I shut my laptop, walked into the kitchen, and sat in the quiet dark, letting the exhaustion finally wash over me. I slept until noon on Saturday. When I finally woke up, my phone was filled with dozens of missed calls and messages, but I ignored them all, enjoying a quiet lunch with Clara and the children. I knew the damage had been repaired and that my work was documented in the system logs. On Monday morning, I arrived at the office at 8:30. The atmosphere in the building was tense, and I could feel the eyes of my colleagues on me as I walked to my desk. Gavin Ward met me with a cup of coffee, telling me that I was a legend in the department. He whispered that Maxwell Holden had spent Friday afternoon reviewing the system logs and the overtime of authorization files. Gavin said that Oliver Croft had been sweating through his suit during the executive meeting, struggling to explain how the entire company had been held hostage by a single optimization script. At 10 in the morning, Sandra Yee from Human Resources called me to the main conference room. When I entered, I found Maxwell Holden, Sandra, and a man I did not recognize, an older consultant named Martin Fletcher. Maxwell stood up, shook my hand warmly, and apologized for the way I had been treated. He stated that the memo restricting my overtime had never been presented to his office and that he would never have approved it. Sandra opened a folder and presented me with a new contract. She explained that my compensation was being restored, with an additional 15% salary increase, and that they would issue full back pay for the period of the cut. Furthermore, Maxwell offered me the permanent position of Director of IT Operations, giving me full authority over the budget and department hiring. I looked at the contract and told them that I would accept, but only on the condition that my technical decisions could not be overridden by non-technical executives. Martin Fletcher smiled and said that was exactly why they wanted me in the role. Maxwell then asked everyone else to leave the room, saying there was a legal matter we needed to discuss. Once we were alone, Maxwell showed me a file of emails that Martin Fletcher had uncovered. The documents showed that Oliver Croft had been in contact with Vertex Solutions for months. Oliver had been promised a lucrative executive position at Vertex in exchange for securing them the database contract. To bypass the security checks, Oliver had forged the digital signature of the chief compliance officer on the system change order. Violating California Penal Code, Section 470, Maxwell explained that the company was filing a civil lawsuit against Oliver Croft for breach of fiduciary duty to recover the $340,000 paid to Vertex, and that they were referring the forgery to the state prosecutor. He asked for my system logs to serve as evidence. I told him I had already compiled the audit trail, showing the exact moments Oliver's credentials were used to override the compliance warnings. Oliver Croft was escorted from the building by security. That afternoon, his startup energy reduced to silent embarrassment. Spencer Finch and Vertex Solutions were dismissed, their contracts terminated immediately. In the weeks that followed, I took over the director role, moving into a corner office that looked out over the city. I immediately hired 3 additional systems administrators, ending the era of understaffed shifts. I established strict documentation rules, ensuring that every script was archived and every database change was reviewed by a committee of engineers. I promoted Gavin Ward to senior manager, placing him in charge of network security. I still worked hard, but I set clear boundaries. I left the office at 5 in the evening, spent my weekends with Clara and the kids, and never answered a call after hours without prior approval. Aegis Capital Group flourished, our systems running with quiet stability because we respected the experience of the people who kept the lights on. One evening, as I walked out of the building into the cool autumn air, I looked back at the glass tower. I realized that my 18 years of dedication had not been outdated, but had been the only thing keeping the company from collapsing. I got into my car and drove home to my family, knowing that I had defined my own worth. Martin Fletcher checked in with me during my 3rd week, wanting to review our transition milestones. He walked into my office, sat down, and commended the stability of the new architecture. I told him that when you respect the expertise of the engineers, the systems behave accordingly. He agreed, noting that the board was highly impressed with our recovery speeds. He also shared that Oliver Croft's legal troubles were worsening. The state prosecutor had formally indicted Oliver for forgery under the state penal code, and his trial was set for next spring. Vertex Solutions was also facing a massive investigation into their contracting practices. After Martin left, I stood by the window and watched the traffic crawl down the avenue. I thought of the late nights I had spent here, the cold dinners, and the constant stress. Now, I was no longer a firefighter reacting to every spark. I was building a department that valued its workers and protected its assets. I had turned their insults into my victory, and in doing so, I had secured a future where my boundaries were respected. I grabbed my coat, shut off the office lights, and left at precisely 5 o'clock. Clara was waiting for me at home, and as we sat down to eat with Julian and Hazel, I knew I had finally won.